The ledger books arrived 3 days before Alma Walker did, shipped ahead by the regional accounting office out of Denver with a letter that read, in no uncertain terms, that the finances of Harlow Creek, Wyoming territory, were in a state of complete and utter disarray, and that the matter required immediate and professional attention. It was the spring of 1884, and Alma Walker had been auditing the financial records of struggling frontier towns for 2 years, ever since she had talked her way into a position that most men in the Denver office had argued a woman had no business holding. She had proven them wrong every single time. She arrived in places with her leather satchel, her sharpened pencils, her clear-eyed way of reading numbers that most people treated like a foreign language, and she left those places with their accounts balanced, their debts charted, and their futures marginally more secure than before. She was 27 years old, unmarried by choice rather than circumstance, and she had learned long ago that a woman who walked into a room with confidence and a ledger book was far more intimidating than anyone expected. She did not expect Harlow Creek to be any different from the dozen other frontier towns she had visited. She was wrong. The stagecoach from Cheyenne rattled and groaned over the last stretch of rutted road before the town came into view, and Alma pressed her face briefly against the dusty window and took her first look at the place. It was smaller than she had anticipated, tucked between a red rock mesa to the north and a wide, shallow creek to the south that gave the town its name. The main street was unpaved but swept clean, which surprised her. The buildings were a mix of weathered timber and newer construction, and what struck her most immediately was a sight she had not seen in any of the other struggling towns on her roster: flower boxes. Nearly every storefront on the main street had wooden flower boxes mounted beneath the windows, and even in early April, there were green shoots pushing up through the dark soil, the first brave tips of something promising. The stagecoach lurched to a stop in front of the post office, and Alma climbed down with her satchel in one hand and her small traveling trunk being handed down behind her by the driver. She straightened her jacket, a practical dark green wool with brass buttons, smoothed her skirt, and looked up and down the street with the quiet, assessing gaze she used when entering any new situation. A man was crossing the street toward her, and he was not what she expected either. She had been told in the brief correspondence that preceded her arrival that the primary account holder responsible for Harlow Creek's municipal finances was one Graham Watkins, who served as both the owner of Watkins Mercantile and the unofficial treasurer of the town council. She had pictured someone older, perhaps heavyset, the kind of man who wore his prosperity like a coat. The man walking toward her was perhaps 32 or 33, lean and broad-shouldered in a plain blue cotton shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows despite the chill in the April air. He had dark hair, slightly overgrown, and a jaw that carried several days of dark stubble. His boots were worn but well-made. His hat was pushed back on his head in a way that suggested he had been working and had forgotten to straighten it. He was looking at her with an expression that she could only describe as cautious apprehension. "Miss Walker," he said, stopping a few feet in front of her. His voice was low and even a plain's voice, the kind that didn't carry unnecessary weight. "That's correct," she said, "and you are Graham Watkins." It was not a question. She had learned early that making things statements rather than questions established a particular kind of footing. "Yes, ma'am," he said. He took his hat off, which she found unexpectedly courteous, and he held it in both hands. "We weren't expecting you until tomorrow." "The road from Cheyenne was in better condition than anticipated," she said. "I hope the early arrival isn't an inconvenience." "No," he said, and there was something in the way he said it that made her think he was choosing his words carefully. "No inconvenience. I'll get your trunk." She watched him lift her trunk with one arm and gesture toward the main street with his hat before settling it back on his head. "Boarding house is this way. Mrs. Calloway keeps a clean room. I sent word ahead to expect you." "You sent word for tomorrow," she pointed out. "I'll send word again," he he said simply. She fell into step beside him, and as they walked down the main street, she noticed things she had already begun cataloging in her mind. The swept boards, the flower boxes, the fresh paint on the schoolhouse facade at the far end of the street, a water pump that looked newly installed at the center of the square, with a stone surround and a cast iron handle that gleamed in the afternoon sun. "The town looks well maintained for one with financial irregularities," she said, keeping her voice neutral. He glanced at her sideways. There was a brief pause before he answered. "People here work hard." It was not an answer to what she had said, but she filed it away. Mrs. Calloway's boarding house was a two-story structure with a covered porch and a rosebush trained along the railing that had not yet bloomed, but showed the dense promise of coming buds. Mrs. Calloway herself turned out to be a small, round woman in her 50s with iron-gray hair and an expression of perpetual alert benevolence, like a hen who has decided all wayward chicks are her personal responsibility. "Oh, you're early," Mrs. Calloway said, looking delighted rather than put out. "Well, no matter, the room is always kept ready. Mr. Watkins sends over the fee at the start of each month regardless, so it's no trouble." Alma filed that away too. She was shown to a room on the second floor that was indeed clean, with a braided rug, a quilt in a log cabin pattern, a washstand with a china pitcher, and a window that looked out over the creek. It was, she thought, nicer than she had reason to expect from a town whose financial records had triggered a formal audit inquiry. After Mrs. Calloway left and Graham Watkins had deposited her trunk with a brief nod and gone back down the stairs, Alma sat on the edge of the bed and opened her satchel. She pulled out the preliminary figures that had been forwarded to the Denver office. They were confusing in a very specific way. The income figures for the town were not particularly remarkable for a frontier settlement of this size, but the expenditure figures were significantly larger than the income figures, which was the flag that had triggered the audit. When expenditures exceeded income, that meant debt, misappropriation, or in some cases, fraud. But the town did not look like a town in debt. It looked like a town being taken care of. She laid the papers out on the small writing desk beneath the window and began to match numbers. The water pump in the square, the paint on the schoolhouse, the flower boxes, the boarding house that always had a room ready. She picked up her pencil and began to write. She was going to need to see those ledger books. Graham Watkins's mercantile was the largest building on the main street, occupying a double lot at the center of the block with a wide porch that spanned the full front of the building. Inside, it smelled of coffee, sawdust, and lamp oil, a smell that Alma associated with every frontier store she had ever visited, that particular combination of practical necessity. The shelves were well stocked and organized, the floor swept, and there were 3 or 4 customers moving quietly through the space when she pushed open the door the following morning at precisely 8 o'clock. Graham was behind the counter measuring out a length of calico for a woman with 2 small children clinging to her skirt, and he looked up when the bell above the door rang. His expression shifted in a way that was subtle but readable, a slight tension in the jaw, a careful settling of composure. He was not pleased to see her, she thought. Or more precisely, he was not pleased to see her because of what she was here to do. That was fine. She was rarely popular when she arrived. "Miss Walker," he said. "I'll be with you in just a moment." She nodded and moved to stand to the side, and she watched him with the same quiet attention she gave everything. He finished measuring the calico, wrapped it in brown paper, and tied it with a piece of string. The woman with the children started to reach for the small coin purse at her wrist, and something happened that Alma watched very carefully. Graham shook his head. "You're paid up through the month, Mrs. Henley," he said. The woman looked briefly uncertain, and then something moved across her face, something between gratitude and a kind of relieved exhaustion. "Mr. Watkins, I don't paid up through the month," he said again, and his voice was quiet and final, and he smiled at her in a way that closed the subject without making it feel like charity. Mrs. Henley gathered her children and her calico and left. Graham watched them go through the window for just a moment before turning to Alma with an expression that was now fully composed. "You'll want to see the books," he said. "I will," she agreed. "All of them, the store accounts, the town council accounts, and anything else you manage." There was a slight pause. "That's quite a lot of material." "I've got time," she said pleasantly. He led her through the store to a back office that was smaller than the main space but organized in the same careful way. A desk, a chair, shelves lined with ledger books in varying states of wear. A small potbelly stove in the corner that had been banked low and gave off a steady, unobtrusive warmth. There was a second chair against the wall, she noticed, which suggested he sometimes had visitors in here, or at least had anticipated the possibility. "I'll need a place to work," she said. "You can use the desk," he said. "I'll work at the counter." She turned to look at him. "This is your office." "It is," he agreed. "And you're the auditor, so it's your office until you're done." She looked at him for a moment longer, then was strictly professional. There was something about the way he said it, not resigned or resentful, but simply matter of fact, as though giving up his space was the obvious and correct thing to do. She had audited men who had literally stood over her shoulder the entire time, reading what she wrote, challenging every figure. She had audited men who had sent lawyers to sit in the room with her. She had audited men who had made pointed comments about whether she was sure she understood what she was looking at. Graham Watkins had offered her his chair and walked away. She sat down, opened the first ledger and began. The first few hours were straightforward. The mercantile's records were meticulous, which was not what she had expected given the state of the forwarded figures. Graham Watkins kept his accounts in a neat, precise hand, every entry dated and described, every transaction accounted for. Income from goods sold, supplier payments, inventory costs, wages for his single employee, a young man named Pete who stocked shelves and made deliveries. Clean books, no irregularities. Then she opened the ledger marked with the initials HC and the word council, and she found the thing that had been flagged. She spent the better part of the morning going through it, making notes in the margin of her own pad, cross-referencing dates and amounts. Sometime around mid-morning, the young man named Pete knocked on the office door and set a mug of coffee on the corner of the desk without being asked. She looked up and he was already retreating. She drank the coffee and kept reading. By the time she emerged from the office at noon, she had a list of entries that required explanation. She found Graham at the counter, helping a rancher select a coil of rope, and she waited without impatience until the transaction was complete. When the rancher left, she set her notepad on the counter between them. "These entries," she said, and she pointed to the first line. "Water infrastructure, $160 in February of last year. New pump and pipe for the square," he said. "The old one went dry. And the schoolhouse, exterior repairs and paint March of last year, $82. Roof was leaking. The teacher, Miss Pratt, had to move all the children to one corner of the room in the rain. The Callaway boarding house maintenance fund, $40 ongoing quarterly." He didn't say anything for a moment. "Mr. Watkins," she said, "I need to understand the source of these funds. The town council's official account shows a balance that would not cover these expenditures. So the question is where the money came from. The options I'm working with are misappropriated funds, an undisclosed loan, or personal contribution. I need to know which." He looked at her steadily. "Personal contribution," he said. She had suspected it, but hearing him say it so directly and without elaboration was still surprising. "How much of your personal income have you contributed to these town expenses?" He reached under the counter and pulled out a second ledger that she had not yet seen, a smaller one, bound in plain brown leather. He set it on the counter between them. "Everything is in there," he said. She opened it. The first entry was dated January 1882. She traced her finger down the column of figures, and as she turned the pages her expression grew slowly, carefully controlled. She was a professional. She did not react openly to what she read, but inside something was happening that she had not expected. By the time she closed the ledger she had her answer. Graham Watkins had been contributing, quietly and consistently, roughly half of his personal income from the mercantile to the running and maintenance of Harlow Creek, not through the town council, not through any official channel, simply as expenditures from his own pocket, logged in a private book that no one had asked him to keep, a record made for accuracy rather than credit. "You never reported these as donations," she said. "No. Why not?" He looked at her for a long moment. There was something in his face that was not quite discomfort, but something adjacent to it, the look of a person being asked to explain something they consider self-evident. "People don't need to feel like they're charity cases," he said finally. "They need a working pump and a dry schoolhouse. The pump works and the school is dry. That's what matters." She looked down at the ledger in her hands. "Mr. Watkins, this creates a significant accounting problem from the Denver office's perspective. When income and expenditure figures don't match up with disclosed sources, it triggers fraud reviews." "I know," he said. "That's why I kept the book, so if anyone came looking, the documentation would be there. You expected someone would come looking." "Eventually," he said. He reached over and turned the coffee mug on the counter by its handle, a small, unconscious gesture. "I figured I'd deal with it when it happened." "And now it's happened," she said. "And now it's happened," he agreed. She looked at him for a long moment. "I'll need to verify these entries against receipts and testimony from the recipients. It's going to take a week, possibly 2. "However long it takes," he said. "I'll give you whatever you need." She returned the ledger to the counter. "This is an unusual situation, Mr. Watkins." "I imagine it is. I've audited a lot of accounts," she said. "I've never encountered a deficit caused by generosity before." He looked at her directly then, and there was something in his eyes, a quiet, unguarded moment, brief as a struck match before it steadied to flame. "First time for everything," he said. She picked up her notepad and walked back to the office. The week that followed was the most interesting of Alma Walker's professional career, and that was saying something considerable. She went through every entry in the private ledger, every single one, and verified it against receipts that Graham had indeed kept, neatly filed in a wooden box under the desk, and against the testimony of the people involved. She spoke to Mrs. Calloway, who turned slightly pink, and said she had always assumed there was some kind of town fund she hadn't asked enough questions about. But yes, the quarterly payments had arrived like clockwork and had allowed her to replace a failing roof beam, maintain the plumbing, and keep a room available for travelers. She spoke to Miss Pratt, the school teacher, a brisk young woman of about 25 who said simply, and with great feeling, that she would not have stayed in Harlow Creek without a schoolhouse that could keep the children dry and warm, and that she had always been told the repairs had come from a community fund. She spoke to a man named Ezra Cole, who ran the blacksmith shop, and who told her that when his forge had needed a new fire brick lining 2 winters ago, and he'd come close to shutting down, Mr. Watkins had fronted him the money at no interest and told him to pay it back whenever his feet were steady again. Alma had found that entry in the ledger too, categorized not as a gift but as a loan, and true to form, Ezra had paid it back in full, and the repayment was there in the private book just as clearly as the original outlay. She spoke to a family named the Beaumonts, a black family who had come west in 1880 with the hope of something better, and who had found Harlow Creek to be at least marginally less brutal than some places, though Mrs. Beaumont told Alma with a directness that Alma deeply respected that life was not without its difficulties, that they had faced hard words and harder looks, that the frontier did not make everyone kind. But she said that Mr. Watkins had always dealt with them square, and when their eldest daughter had needed school books that they couldn't afford, those books had appeared with no explanation and no strings attached. Alma went back to the ledger and found the entry, school books, 4 volumes, September 1882. No name attached, just the date and the cost and a brief description. The injustice of what the Beaumont family navigated daily in the territory sat with Alma in a way that didn't leave her easily. She had seen it in other towns, the sharp edges of exclusion, The way certain people were asked to be grateful for crumbs while others helped themselves freely to the loaf. What struck her about Graham Watkins was not that he had solved the problem, because no single man's generosity could undo the structural hostility that people like the Beaumonts faced, but he had refused to participate in it. He had treated them the same as everyone else, and in a world where that was not guaranteed, it was not a small thing. She thought about this while she walked back to the boarding house one evening, the sky above the Wyoming territory going that particular shade of apricot and violet that she had never seen anywhere else, the air smelling of wood smoke and the cold, clean freshness of the creek. She thought about it again that night while she lay awake and listened to the quiet of the town, a quiet that was different from Denver's quiet, more complete, more expectant somehow. She thought about Graham Watkins, too, which was less professional and more inevitable. He had been unfailingly courteous to her throughout the week. He brought coffee in the mornings without being asked and without making a production of it. He answered every question she put to him directly and without evasion, which was so unusual in her line of work that she had begun to look for the angle she must be missing, and she had not found one. He worked long hours at the counter and in the stock room, and in the evening she sometimes saw him from the boarding house window walking the main street in the late light, not in a patrol or anything organized, just walking, in the way of a man who knows every board and stone of a place and feels responsible for it. On the fifth day she found an entry that stopped her. It was dated October 1883, less than 6 months ago. It read simply, "Medical Beaumont Family, $45. And beneath it in a bracket, "Not to be discussed," she went to find Graham. He was in the back of the store unpacking a crate of canned goods, and he straightened when she came through the curtain with her notepad in hand. She showed him the entry without preamble. He looked at it and then looked at her. There was a beat of silence. "Mrs. Beaumont was ill last autumn," he said. "The doctor's fee and the medicine together, her husband couldn't cover it." "The bracket says not to be discussed," Alma said. "With me or in general?" "In general," he said. "Thomas Beaumont is a proud man. I told the doctor to put the bill on my account and say it had been settled. Thomas never needed to know by whom." Alma was quiet for a moment. "And if I document this as part of the audit record?" "Then you document it," he said simply. "The audit record stays in Denver, not in Harlow Creek." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she made a note and turned to go back to the office. At the curtain she paused. "Mr. Watkins," she said without turning around. "Miss Walker, why does this town matter so much to you?" A long pause. She turned around then because she wanted to see his face. He was standing with the crate in his hands, and he set it down on the stockroom shelf before he answered. "My father came out here in '71, he said. "Nothing but the land and a tent and $40. People helped him. Not because they had to, because that's what people out here did or were supposed to do. He built this store. He kept the books and he kept his word, and when he died 4 years ago, the whole town came to the funeral. That's what he built." He paused. "I'm just continuing the work." She held his gaze for a moment. There was something in his face when he talked about his father, a quiet, contained grief, the kind that has been lived with long enough that it no longer shakes you but never fully releases you either. "I'm sorry about your father," she said. "Thank you," he said, and the simplicity of it matched everything else about him. That was the moment, though she didn't name it as such until later. That was the moment when the auditor began to shift into something else, something less detached, something that had to do with the particular way he stood with his hands at his sides and his voice steady, and his eyes dark and honest. She walked back to the office and stared at the ledger for 10 minutes without writing anything. On the 7th day, trouble arrived in the form of a man named Clement Farrow. Alma heard the raised voice from the front of the store while she was working, and she looked up from her desk and listened. The voice was not Graham's. It was louder and had a specific kind of aggressive texture, the kind that used volume as a preemptive weapon. She put down her pencil and went through the curtain. Clement Farrow was a man in his mid-40s, wide through the chest, with a territorial air and the kind of expression that suggested he was unaccustomed to hearing the word no. He was standing at the counter across from Graham, and there was a small cluster of other customers who had gone very still in the way that frontier people recognized as the precursor to something unpleasant. "I want to know who authorized the water line extension to the south end," Farrow was saying. "The town council never voted on it." "The council's next meeting was 6 weeks out," Graham said, and his voice was that same level, even tone she had come to recognize. "The South End families were pulling water from the creek. 2 children were sick from it. That's not the point. The point is procedure. The point is who is spending town money without authorization." "My own money," Graham said. "That's what you say." Farrow's eyes slid sideways to Alma, who had come through the curtain and was standing at the edge of the store floor with her notepad in hand and her expression professionally neutral. "And what are you?" "Alma Walker," she said. "I'm the auditor from the regional accounting office in Denver. Mr. Watkins has fully documented every expenditure related to the town's maintenance. If you have concerns about the financial records, I'm the appropriate person to discuss them with." Farrow looked at her with the particular kind of dismissal that Alma had long since learned to treat as irrelevant. "A woman auditor." "Yes," she said. "Would you like to see my credentials, or would you prefer to continue being loud at the wrong person?" The silence that followed was the kind that counted. Then one of the other customers, an older man in a rancher's hat, made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh, and the tension broke slightly around the edges. Farrow looked between Alma and Graham, recalibrated something internally, and turned back to Graham. "This isn't finished," he said. "Whenever you're ready," Graham said. Farrow left. The store breathed again. Alma turned and went back through the curtain, and she was almost to the desk when she heard Graham's footstep behind her. "Miss Walker," she turned. "Thank you," he said. There was something in his eyes, a brightness that had not been there before, something that might have been amusement if it hadn't also been something warmer. "You didn't have to come out." "I had a professional reason to," she said. "Yes," he said. He was leaning in the doorway of the office with one hand on the doorframe, and the late afternoon light from the small window fell across him in a way that she would have found inconveniently pleasant to think about. "Yes, you did." She turned back to the desk and picked up her pencil with a hand that was perfectly steady. That evening, Mrs. Calloway served dinner at the long table in the boarding house dining room with several other boarders, 2 traveling salesmen and an older woman who was visiting her sister, and conversation ran to the usual frontier topics: weather, cattle prices, the quality of the road from Cheyenne. Alma listened and ate the stew, which was very good, and let the conversation flow around her while she thought. She had enough to write her report. The findings were clear. There was no fraud, no misappropriation, no debt. What there was one man quietly paying for half a town's existence out of his own earnings and saying nothing about it. The audit report would document it, send it to Denver, and presumably close the inquiry. She could leave by the end of the week. The thought was less appealing than it should have been. The following morning she walked to the store earlier than usual before the 8 o'clock opening and found Graham on the porch replacing a board that had begun to split. He was on his knees with a hammer and nails, and he looked up when her shadow fell across him. "I can come back," she said. "You don't have to," he said. He sat back on his heels and turned the hammer over in his hands. "Coffee's made. Pete's not in until 9. You've got the office to yourself." She looked at him on the porch in the early morning light. The sky still that pale, thin blue of early April. A cool wind moving through the main street and lifting a handful of dust at the far corner. There was something so ordinary about the scene, a man fixing his porch, a spring morning, and something so quietly extraordinary about the context she now carried, the full picture of who he was and what he had been doing for years without telling anyone. She sat down on the porch step. This surprised him. She could see it in the brief shift of his expression. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said. "You can ask," he said. "Do you ever get tired of it, carrying all of this by yourself?" He was quiet for a moment, fitting the new board into place with his fingers before taking the hammer to it. The sound of nails going in was clean and definitive. "Sometimes," he said when he was done. He set the hammer on the porch and looked out at the street. "There are days when the account is lower than I'd like, and I'm trying to work out whether the school needs fuel more than the Callaway roof needs patching, and I think about how much easier it would be if I just kept my own money. And then Miss Pratt's kids come out for recess and they're laughing, and the thought goes away." She looked at his profile, the strong line of jaw under the dark stubble. The way his eyes went distant when he talked about things he cared about. "Who takes care of you?" she said, and then she felt the words land and immediately wondered if that had been too direct. He turned to look at her. For a moment, neither of them said anything. A horse passed on the street below, its hooves a slow, deliberate rhythm. The wind lifted a strand of Alma's dark hair from beneath her hat, and she reached up and tucked it back. "Nobody's asked me that in a while," he said. "I'm asking," she said. He looked at her for another long moment, and something moved across his face that she recognized not as a single expression but as a series of them, too quick to name, like pages turning. "I get by," he said finally. "That's not the same thing," she said, and she stood, brushing the porch dust from her skirt. "Coffee, you said." "Through the door, first door on the left," he said, and his voice had something in it now that it hadn't had before. She couldn't name it precisely, but it sat with her all through the morning. The second week was different. The professional task was largely complete. She had her documentation, her verified entries, her clear and defensible audit findings. What remained was the formal writing of the report, which she could do at the desk in the mercantile office or at the boarding house, and which did not strictly require her to interact with Graham Watkins at all. She chose the mercantile office. In the late afternoons, when the store was quiet, he sometimes came through the curtain to check on the stove or retrieve something from the file shelves, and they began to talk. Not about the accounts, about other things. He asked her where she was from, and she told him about growing up in Ohio, the youngest of 4 daughters of a schoolteacher father and a mother who had made sure all 4 of them could read and calculate and argue a point. He listened with the particular attentiveness of someone genuinely interested, not performing attention, actually giving it. She found that she enjoyed talking to him, which was not something she had expected to find in Harlow Creek, Wyoming territory. She asked him about the town's history, and he told her. About the early years, when there were only a dozen families and the winters were brutal, and the question of survival was not rhetorical. About the Shoshone people whose territory this had been, and the injustice of their removal, a history he spoke about with directness, and without the casual dismissal she had heard from other men in the territory who treated such things as simply the natural order. He said his father had traded fairly with the Shoshone and had considered them neighbors, and that he himself had tried to continue that principle in whatever way was still possible, which he acknowledged was limited and insufficient given what had been done. She found this honesty striking. There were not many men who could hold that kind of moral accounting with clear eyes. On the Tuesday of the second week, there was a town social at the church hall, a spring gathering with fiddle music and potluck food, and the particular exuberant communal energy of people who have spent a long winter in each other's company and are glad to come back out into the warmth. Mrs. Callaway informed Alma at dinner that it was not optional from a social perspective, and that attendance was expected, and then looked at her with such transparent hopefulness that Alma found herself agreeing. She put on the nicest dress she had brought, a deep blue with a white collar, more practical than fine but clean and well-fitted, and she walked to the church hall with Mrs. Callaway and found the inside already warm and bright. Lanterns hung from the rafters, tables laden with food, and a 3-piece ensemble consisting of a fiddle, a guitar, and a man with a harmonica who was clearly enjoying himself very much. Graham Watkins was already there, standing with a group of men near the back wall, and he looked up when she came in. He was wearing a clean white shirt and his hair had been combed, which was different from his usual working day appearance, and the difference did things to her composure that she declined to analyze in a church hall. He came over. "Miss Walker," he said, "I didn't know you were coming." "Mrs. Calloway is persuasive," she said. "She is that," he agreed, and there was a warmth in his expression that felt easy and unguarded, different from the careful professional he had been in the store. "Can I get you something to eat, Mrs.?" Beaumont brought her corn bread, which is not to be missed under any circumstances. They ate corn bread and talked, and at some point the fiddle music shifted into something with a dancing tempo, and Alma looked at the floor where several couples were forming up, and before she had consciously decided anything, Graham was holding out his hand. "Miss Walker," he said, "may I have the honor?" She looked at his hand. Then she looked at his face, and the careful, hopeful expression on it was so human and unguarded that she felt something loosen in her chest. "You may," she said, and she took his hand. He danced the way she had come to expect everything from him, steadily, without show, attentive to his partner, competent without making it about competence. His hand on her waist was warm through the fabric of her dress, and he held her at the proper distance, though as the music swelled through a particularly lively reel, the distance closed somewhat and neither of them increased it again. "You're a good dancer," she said. "My mother's doing," he said. She held the view that a man who couldn't dance was a man with no consideration for the people around him. "She sounds like a remarkable woman." "She was," he said, and again that quiet, present grief. "She passed 2 years after my father. I think she missed him too much to stay." Alma thought about that, about a love so complete that its ending was the ending of everything, and she looked at Graham's face and found it open in a way that said he had told her something real. "I'm sorry," she said. "So am I," he said. "But they had a good life together. 40 years and they still sat close at the table. I used to think that was just how people were. I've learned since that it's rare." The music softened and slowed, and they were still dancing. The floor had thinned around them somewhat as some couples stepped away to rest or eat, but neither Alma nor Graham moved toward the edge of the floor. "Mr. Watkins," she said, and she was looking up at him now because they had drifted closer, "my report is nearly finished." "I know," he said. "I'll be leaving at the end of the week." A pause. His hand at her waist was perfectly still. "I know that too," he said. "I don't want to leave," she said, and then she felt the words hang in the air between them, honest and unretractable, and she held his gaze. He looked at her for a long, full moment. Then something shifted in his expression, something that was all the careful, contained warmth of the past 2 weeks coming to a single, clear point. "Then don't," he said. The music was playing, but Alma no longer entirely heard it. "It's not that simple," she said. "It doesn't have to be complicated either," he said. "I'm a man who keeps his books straight. I think you already know I'm going to say something that I mean." "I do know that," she said. "That's part of the problem." "How is that a problem?" She laughed, which surprised her, a small, real, unplanned laugh. "Because it makes it harder to be sensible about leaving." He smiled, and it was the first full smile she had seen from him. Not the small, careful one he used with customers, but a real one, and it changed his face entirely, opening it up in a way that was nearly overwhelming in its warmth. "Then consider being sensible about staying," he said. They were standing still now, the dancing long since stopped. The music moved on to something new, and other people were around them, but Alma was not aware of them in any meaningful way. She was aware of the warmth of his hand and the steadiness of his eyes and the feeling that was not professional and was not a passing thing, and was, in fact, the most inconvenient and welcome thing she had experienced in years. "I'll think about it," she said, and she meant it more seriously than those words usually carried. He inclined his head slightly, that quiet, attentive gesture she had come to recognize. "That's all I'll ask," he said. They walked back to Mrs. Calloway's in the cool April night, a group of other boarders and townspeople moving in the same general direction, so it was not a private thing. But at the boarding house gate, Graham held it open for her, and they stood together for a moment in the small space of the gateway while the others filed past. "Good night, Miss Walker," he said. "Good night, Mr. Watkins," she said. She went inside and climbed the stairs to her room and sat down on the bed without taking off her coat, and stared at the quilt pattern for a long time. The next morning she went to see Mrs. Calloway before breakfast and asked about the possibility of extending her stay for an additional 2 weeks. Mrs. Calloway's expression went through several visible stages of satisfaction before she got it under control. "Of course," she said warmly. "The room is yours for as long as you like." Alma went to the mercantile at 8 o'clock and let herself in with the key Graham had given her for the office. She had her report nearly complete, but she was not finished, and the reasons for this were both professional and personal, and she was beginning to stop trying to separate them. He came in at 8:15 and found her already at the desk. He stood in the doorway for a moment with his coffee and looked at her. "You're still here," he said. "I told Mrs. Calloway I'd stay another 2 weeks," she said, keeping her eyes on the ledger. A pause. "Good," he said. And the single word, the simple, direct, unembellished good, did more for her than any speech would have. In the 2 weeks that followed, Harlow Creek revealed itself to Alma in the way that places only do when you stop being a visitor and start being something else. She began to know people by name, not as entries in a ledger or sources of testimony, but as individuals. She helped Miss Pratt organize a book order for the school, using her contacts in Denver to get a better price on a set of readers than the town had previously found. She spent an afternoon with Mrs. Beaumont, who was a gifted seamstress, learning about the dress patterns she had brought from Georgia, and listening to her talk about the long and difficult road that had brought her family to Wyoming, the hope and the hardship both, and the particular brand of dignified determination with which she met both. She spent her evenings increasingly with Graham, sometimes at the boarding house, sometimes walking along the creek in the long evening light that the Wyoming spring produced in such generous abundance. They talked about everything and nothing. He told her about the dreams he had for the town, not grandiose plans, but careful, practical ones. A library, even a small one. A second doctor. A proper bridge over the creek before the next flood season. She listened and asked questions and contributed ideas, and somewhere in the midst of this she realized that she was not thinking about Denver anymore, not about her schedule, not about her next assignment. On a Thursday afternoon in the 3rd week of April, Clement Farrow made a reappearance. This time he was on the steps of the mercantile when Alma arrived in the morning, and he had with him a man she hadn't seen before, stout and formal-looking in a suit that was too good for Harlow Creek, carrying a leather briefcase. "That's the auditor from Denver," Farrow said to the suited man, nodding at Alma. The suited man looked at her with an assessment she recognized as a challenge. "My name is Harris Fielding," he said. "I'm an attorney representing several members of the town council in a formal complaint about the management of the council's accounts." Alma stopped on the lower step and looked at him with the same calm she brought to every obstruction. "And the nature of the complaint," she said. "The nature is that Mr. Watkins has been making unilateral financial decisions regarding town infrastructure without council authorization," Fielding said. "We're seeking a formal accounting and potential disciplinary action." "The accounting is complete," Alma said. "I am the regional accounting office's auditor, and my report is almost finalized. If you have legal concerns about the town council's records, you are welcome to request a copy of the completed report through the proper channels. Until that report is submitted, I am the only authorized party to discuss its contents." Fielding looked at her with the expression she had been receiving from certain men for her entire career, but she had stopped being troubled by it somewhere around the 2nd year. She simply waited, holding his gaze with perfect composure. "Mr. Watkins has been operating outside the council's mandate," Farrow said loudly. "Mr. Watkins has been operating with his own funds," Alma said, "which is not within the council's jurisdiction. If Mr. Watkins chose to fix a leaking schoolhouse roof with money from his own pocket, neither the council nor its attorney has any authority over that choice." Farrow's face reddened. He uses the council's name. He does not, Alma said. Not once in 2 years of meticulous records. Every community contribution from Mr. Watkins's personal account is documented as such. None of them are attributed to the council. She paused. In fact, if there is anyone in a vulnerable position as a result of this audit, it is not Mr. Watkins. That hung in the air for a moment. Graham had come out of the store during this exchange and was standing in the doorway. He had not said anything, and when Alma glanced at him, she saw that he was watching her with an expression she could not fully read, something between surprise and something much warmer. Fielding and Farrow conferred in low voices, and then Fielding said with somewhat reduced certainty that he would be in touch with the Denver office. "The report will be filed by end of month," Alma said pleasantly. "I wish you gentlemen a good morning." They left. Alma turned to face Graham on the step. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. "The findings are accurate. I'm entitled to defend them." He looked at her for a long, quiet moment. "Come inside," he said. "I'll make coffee." She sat at the counter for the first time rather than in the back office, and he made the coffee on the small stove behind the counter, and they were quiet together for a little while in the way of two people who have passed the point of needing to fill silence. "Farrow's been on the council for 3 years," Graham said finally. "He doesn't like things he didn't authorize. He especially doesn't like the idea that someone might do things for the town that he can't take credit for. He's afraid the report will make him look small," Alma said. "It won't," Graham said. "You're not that kind of auditor." She looked up from her coffee. "How do you know what kind of auditor I am?" "I know what kind of person you are," he said simply. "Which is more relevant?" She held his gaze, and the morning light came through the store's front windows and lay in long, clean lines across the floor between them. "Graham," she said, using his given name for the first time without thinking about it, just saying it naturally. A small shift in his expression. He noticed. "Alma," he said. She set down her coffee mug. "What do you think would happen," she said carefully, "if the Denver office auditor were to remain in Harlow Creek beyond her professional assignment?" He was still for a moment. Then he set his own mug down on the counter. "I think it would depend a great deal on the auditor's personal intentions," he said. "And if her personal intentions were," she stopped. "Were," he said softly. "Were to stay," she said. "Not for the audit, not professionally, to stay." The store was very quiet. Pete was in the back doing inventory, and his presence was a distant sound of crates being moved. Outside, the main street had its usual morning texture of activity. A horse, voices, the distant ring of Ezra Cole's hammer from the blacksmith shop. Graham came around the counter slowly, and he stood in front of her on the customer's side, and they were eye to eye, or nearly, and she was looking up at him by an inch or two. "Alma Walker," he said, and the way he said her full name was deliberate, as though he was putting it somewhere he intended to keep it. "I am not a man who says things he doesn't mean, so I'm going to say this carefully." "All right," she said. "In 2 weeks you have made this town feel different to me," he said. "I have been here my whole life, and I know every board and stone of it, and I have been working, and I have been doing my best, and I have been—" He stopped, and something crossed his face that was not embarrassment but a close neighbor. "I have been alone in it," he said. "Not lonely exactly, but alone. And since you sat on my porch step at 7 in the morning and asked me who takes care of me, that word has felt less accurate." She felt the warmth of that move through her chest and settle. "I would like you to stay," he said. "Not because this town needs another set of organized books, though God knows it might, because I would like very much for you to stay, if you have any feeling in that direction." "I have," she said, "a very significant feeling in that direction." He reached out and took her hand from where it rested on the counter, and held it in both of his, and it was the most uncomplicated and complete thing that had happened to her in a very long time. "Good," he said, for the second time in that same simple way, and she laughed, and he smiled, and the morning light lay in long lines across the floor of the mercantile. The days that followed were extraordinary in their ordinariness and their warmth. She finished the report. A thorough and clear-eyed document that presented Graham's contributions as exactly what they were: personal charitable contributions to the community's well-being, fully documented, entirely transparent on examination, and entirely laudable in nature. The report recommended that the town council establish a formal community fund to provide a more official channel for such contributions, and further recommended that the council acknowledge and appreciate the private expenditures that had kept the town functional during its lean years. It was the best report she had ever written, she thought, partly because the subject matter was genuinely unusual and worthy, and partly because she had never known the subject of an audit as a person before, not in the way she knew Graham. She sent the report by express post to Denver on a Friday morning in late April, and when she came back to the mercantile, she told Graham it was done. "And," he said, "and the findings are in your favor," she said. "Complete financial transparency, no irregularities, personal contributions documented and verified. The fraud inquiry is closed." He let out a breath that she recognized as more release than he had expected to need. "That's good," he said. "You were never in real danger," she said. "The books told the truth. You kept them well." "I always intended for someone to read them someday," he said. He looked at her. "I'm glad it was you." She looked at her hands for a moment and then at him. "I wrote in the report recommendations for a community fund. If the council establishes it, you won't have to do this alone anymore. There can be official channels." "That was your idea," he said. "It was a logical recommendation," she said. "Alma." He said her name with the same quiet intention as the first time. "Thank you." She looked at him, and it took everything in her professional training not to close the distance between them immediately in the middle of a mercantile with Pete in the back room. "You're welcome, Graham," she said. She wrote a letter to the Denver office that afternoon, formally requesting a transfer to the Wyoming Territory District and citing the need for more consistent regional coverage. She did not mention personal reasons. She did not need to. The letter was professionally composed and logistically sound, and 2 weeks later, she received a reply that was largely agreeable, with a note that the territory's accounts were considerable and that a resident auditor would be an asset. She told Graham about the letter over dinner at the boarding house on a Wednesday evening in early May. The windows were open to the spring air, and the cottonwood trees along the creek had come into their new green, and the flower boxes on the main street had filled out into a riot of early blooms. He was very still when she told him. Then he said, "That means you'll be here." "That means I'll be here," she confirmed. He was quiet for a moment that felt full of something, and then he said, "I'll need to speak to you about something important. After dinner, if you're willing." She said she was. After dinner, they walked along the creek in the long May evening, the water bright and chattering over stones, the air warm with the last of the day's sun. Graham walked beside her and was quiet for a little while, and she let the quiet be, because she had learned that he used it to gather himself for things that mattered. "I want to ask you something," he said at last. "Ask," she said. He stopped walking, and she stopped too, and they stood at the edge of the creek with the water noise around them and the first stars beginning to appear in the eastern sky. "I know that 2 weeks, even a month, is not a long time," he said. "And I know you have a life and a career and plans that were not made in Harlow Creek." He paused. "I'm not asking you to give those up. I wouldn't ask that." "Then what are you asking?" she said softly. He turned to face her fully, and the evening light was gold on his face, and the careful, serious honesty in his expression was so characteristic of him that she felt it like a physical thing. "I'm asking if you would consider making plans that include Harlow Creek," he said. "That include me. I know I'm the man who keeps the books and fixes the porch and has no particular eloquence about him. I know you could find a more impressive situation, but I don't think you'd find a more sincere one." He paused. "I love you, Alma. I've been heading in that direction since you sat on my porch step at 7 in the morning and asked who takes care of me, and I am there now, completely and with no reservation." She looked at him for a long moment in the gold evening. Then she stepped forward and took his face in both her hands, and she kissed him, and it was everything that 2 weeks of steady, building, undeniable feeling had been moving toward, and he kissed her back with a warmth and a tenderness that was exactly as she had known he would be. When they stepped back, both of them were smiling. "I love you too," she said. "I have been writing ledger columns and thinking about you since the 5th day, and that is a significant distraction for an auditor, and I hold you entirely responsible." He laughed, and she had now heard him laugh properly only a handful of times, and it was one of the finest sounds she knew. "I'll accept that responsibility," he said. He took her hand, and they stood at the edge of the creek in the last of the evening light, and the water ran over stones, and the sky darkened toward true night, and the first stars sharpened and multiplied, and neither of them said anything for a while because nothing needed saying. In July, on a hot, clear morning with the smell of sage in the air, and the creek running low and bright, Alma Walker became Alma Watkins in the small white church at the end of the main street, with Mrs. Calloway weeping happily in the front pew and Miss Pratt's students lined up on the church steps to throw flower petals, and Thomas and Miriam Beaumont seated with dignity in the middle of the congregation, and Ezra Cole tugging at his collar in the heat and grinning, and Pete looking proud in a borrowed coat. Mrs. Calloway had put roses everywhere. The flower boxes on the main street were at their summer peak, red and yellow and white, and someone had tied a ribbon across the church door. Graham stood at the altar in a new coat that Alma had selected with him at the mercantile and that fit him well, and when she walked up the aisle on her own because her father was in Ohio, and she was, in the end, a woman who walked herself to the places she chose to go, he looked at her with an expression that she would carry with her for the rest of her life, open and certain and full. The preacher said the words, and they said the words back. And when Graham put the plain gold band on her finger, she looked at his hands, the careful, steady hands that had kept a town's accounts and fixed its porch boards and carried its sick, and written its flower boxes into existence through nothing more than consistent, unannounced generosity. And she thought that she had audited a great many books in her professional career, and had never once expected to find, at the bottom of a ledger, something this complete. The summer unfolded. She kept her work with the Denver office, riding the quarterly circuit through the Wyoming territory districts, which allowed her to keep both her profession and her home. Graham kept the mercantile and the books and the ongoing unofficial maintenance of Harlow Creek, though now there was a formal community fund, established by the council with her recommendation, and enough public discussion that Clement Farrow had eventually voted for it too, grudgingly but correctly. It meant that the town's needs were shared more broadly now, that other residents who had means contributed alongside Graham, and that the work was no longer carried by one set of shoulders. He still rose early and walked the main street in the mornings. She sometimes walked with him. The flower boxes were always full. She had taken over one corner of the mercantile's back office with her own files, her pencils, her portable writing slope, and the organized precision of her working life, and it sat next to his organized precision, and the combination was, she thought, an accurate picture of them. By October, she knew she was expecting their first child. She told him on a Sunday morning when the store was closed and they were sitting at breakfast in the rooms above the mercantile that they had made into their home, the windows looking out over the street and the creek and the mesa beyond. He went very still. Then he reached across the table and took her hand with both of his, the same way he had that first time, and he looked at her with that full, open, contained warmth that was uniquely and completely his. "Are you well?" was the first thing he said. "Very well," she said. "Good," he said. "Good," and then quieter, "We're going to have a child." "We are," she said. He held her hand and looked out at the October mesa, which was going golden and russet in the autumn light, and she watched his face move through the same series of quiet expressions she had learned to read, and at the end of all of them was simply happiness. "I'll speak to the doctor," he said. "I've already spoken to the doctor," she said. He looked at her and smiled. "Of course you have." "She says the spring most likely," Alma said. "March or April." "Same as the flowers," he said softly. She laughed. "Practical minds," she said. The winter was long and cold and full, the way Wyoming winters were. She reduced her travel circuit and took on more correspondence work from the warmth of the mercantile office. Graham banked the stove higher and left the coffee pot perpetually warm and did not suggest, not once, that she ought to rest more or do less, or be any different from what she was. When the audit for the Cheyenne district came across her desk and she said she intended to complete it by correspondence, he simply asked if she needed more lamp oil, and she found this, in its own quiet way, deeply romantic. The community fund had its first full year of operation, and the results were visible. A lending library was established in a room above the post office, with 37 volumes donated by residents and 12 ordered through Alma's Denver connections. The bridge over the creek was improved before the spring floods, a project the council had discussed for 3 years, and which now got done because the funding mechanism existed, and there was no reason not to. Miss Pratt's school got a second stove and a proper bookcase, and Miss Pratt herself wrote a letter to the Denver office thanking them for the auditor they had sent to Harlow Creek, and specifying that the results had been rather beyond the scope of a standard financial review. In March, their son was born on a Thursday morning when the wind was coming down from the north, and the creek was running high with snowmelt. He was born in the rooms above the mercantile, with the doctor and Mrs. Calloway in attendance, and Graham sat beside Alma through all of it and held her hand until the doctor told him firmly to please stand back, and then held it again the moment he was allowed. The baby was healthy and loud and had Alma's dark hair and what Mrs. Calloway insisted were Graham's eyes, and lay on Alma's chest in the first winter light of the morning like something entirely extraordinary. "What do we call him?" Graham said. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, and his voice had a quality she had never heard in it before, layered and soft and full. "I've been thinking Henry," she said, "after your father." He looked at her. The expression on his face was the most unguarded she had ever seen him, and that was saying a great deal. "Alma," he said. "Henry Graham Watkins," she said. "If you like." He pressed his forehead gently to hers, their son between them in the morning light, and neither of them spoke for a long moment. "I like," he said. Henry Graham Watkins arrived in the world in March of 1885 in Harlow Creek, Wyoming Territory, and grew up knowing the full name of every person in town. His mother taught him numbers and letters with the same clear-eyed rigor she applied to everything, and his father taught him how to sweep a porch, fix a board, and keep a book straight. He was 3 when his parents explained, in age-appropriate terms, that some people in the world were treated unfairly because of the color of their skin, and that this was wrong, and that the correct response was not acceptance, but action in whatever form was available to you. It was something the Beaumont family helped teach him, because Miriam Beaumont had a patience and a directness with children that was formidable, and he spent many afternoons at their table, which was a fact that both his parents considered a gift. The mercantile grew steadily. Alma's work with the Denver office continued, the Wyoming Territory's accounts being extensive enough to keep a resident auditor perpetually occupied, and she became known in the territory, not only for the quality of her financial work, but for the unusual depth of her community knowledge. The way her reports included context and history and human detail that made them more useful than the dry numerical documents most auditors produced. 2 years after Henry, they had a daughter whom they named Clara, and she arrived in the same March window as her brother, in the same rooms above the mercantile, into the same pair of steady, careful hands. Clara had Graham's dark eyes and Alma's particular brand of extremely focused attention, which was evident from approximately her 3rd month of life. The town grew. The post office expanded. A second doctor arrived in 1887, a young man fresh from a medical college in the East who had heard, somewhat to everyone's surprise, that Harlow Creek was the kind of frontier town where a doctor could actually build a practice. because the town had a functional community fund and a population that took health seriously. He set up a proper surgery on the main street, 2 doors down from the mercantile, and within a year he was overextended in the best possible way. Clement Farrow, for his part, became in later years a more complicated figure than his early antagonism suggested. He was still difficult and territorial and inclined to make things about his own authority, but the establishment of the formal community fund had given him an official channel for his desire for control, and within that channel he was, when properly directed, reasonably useful. He never precisely apologized to Graham for the attorney and the accusations, but he did, one autumn evening at the town social, shake Graham's hand with a specific kind of grip that carried in it something that might have been acknowledgment. Graham shook his hand back with the same even composure he applied to everything, and Alma, watching from across the room with Henry on her hip, thought that this, too, was characteristic of him, the willingness to accept an unspoken apology and let it settle without extracting a full accounting. In 1888, 3 years after Henry and 1 after Clara, Alma found herself expecting again, and this time it was twins, a development that the doctor announced with a professional calm that was barely concealing his delight, and that sent Graham to sit on the porch in the April evening for about 20 minutes before coming back inside with the equanimity of a man who had decided that equanimity was the appropriate response. 2, he said. 2, she confirmed. He sat down at the kitchen table. We'll need a bigger porch, he said. She started to laugh. We need a bigger everything. Pete's been wanting more responsibility anyway, he said, meaning Pete from the store, now 25 and fully capable of running the mercantile's daily operations. This seems like an appropriate moment to formalize that. You have already started problem solving, she said, watching him. I'm a man who keeps his books straight, he said, looking at her across the table with that full, warm directness that still, 4 years in, made her feel it somewhere in her chest. I work with what I have. She reached across the table and took his hand, and he turned it over and held hers in both of his, the same as always. You have quite a lot, she said. I know, he said. And he looked at her in the lamplight of their kitchen above the mercantile, with the spring night outside the windows and the creek audible below, and the sounds of their sleeping children in the rooms beyond, and the whole settled, full, particular life they had built together present in every detail of the moment. The twins arrived in November, a boy and a girl, William and me, delivered by a considerably more experienced doctor than the one who had attended Henry. And while the experience was more complicated than the previous 2 had been, Alma came through it with the same clear-eyed resilience she brought to all difficult things. And by the time the first snow of winter was falling past the bedroom window, she was sitting up in bed with a baby in each arm and Graham beside her, looking like a man who has been given more than he expected and is not entirely sure how to contain it. They're very small, he said. They'll get bigger, she said. Henry was smaller than I expected too, he said. Now he steals my hat. He's 5, she pointed out. He's testing boundaries. He's your son, Graham said. He's your son, she returned. He keeps a ledger of his allowance. Graham looked at her sideways. That's your influence. That's common sense, she said. William had Graham's steady temperament and me had Alma's precision, which became evident at approximately age 2 and remained consistent thereafter. Henry grew into a thoughtful, serious child who loved animals and mathematics with equal passion, and who had his mother's ability to walk into a room and assess it, and his father's willingness to do what was needed without being asked. Clara was bright and quick and social, the one who knew everyone's name and everyone's business, and who charmed her way through every situation with a combination of genuine warmth and impressive manipulation that Alma watched with a kind of professional admiration. The lending library above the post office expanded twice, once in 1887 and again in 1890. By the time of the second expansion, It held over 200 volumes and had a part-time librarian in the form of a retired schoolteacher from Laramie named Mr. Frost, who took the position with the seriousness of a calling, and who spent his first month reorganizing the collection in a way that Miss Pratt, now Mrs. Danby, following a quiet marriage to the blacksmith's assistant, said was the most satisfying thing she had witnessed in years. The bridge over the creek was rebuilt properly in 1889, a real timber structure that could take a loaded wagon, and the ceremony when it opened was attended by the whole town and involved Mrs. Calloway's corn bread in quantities that suggested she had been planning for months. Graham stood at the ribbon with the council and looked across the new bridge at the creek below, and the South End families on the far bank, who no longer had to ford the water on foot. And Alma stood beside him with me on her hip and William holding her hand and Henry running back and forth across the bridge because it was new and magnificent, and she thought that this was what a life looked like when it was built right. That evening, after the children were in bed, she and Graham sat on the porch of the mercantile in the September evening, the air cooling and the stars enormous in the Wyoming sky, and she leaned her head against his shoulder and he put his arm around her, and they were quiet in the particular way they still did after 5 years of marriage that had never lost its quality. "I've been thinking about the library," she said. "What about it?" "We need more books on mathematics," she said. "Henry's going through everything Mr. Frost has, and there's a correspondence curriculum from the university in Laramie that could work for him if he wanted to go deeper." "He's 8, Graham said. "He's 8 now," she said. "He'll be 18 in 10 years. He was quiet for a moment. "Are you already planning his education at 10 years out?" "I'm making projections," she said. "It's what I do." She felt him smile against her hair. "All right," he said. "What else are you projecting?" She thought about it. The town spread out before them, the flower boxes dark in the evening but promised, the new bridge visible at the far end of the street, the lights in the windows of the houses and the boarding house and the school. The water pump in the square, standing in the moonlight with the same bright certainty as the day it was installed. The library window above the post office. The community fund that had made so much of this possible, and the original private ledger in Graham's hand that had been the beginning of all of it. A school for the older children, she said, beyond Miss Pratt's level. A proper secondary curriculum, mathematics and writing and history. There are enough families now. That would require a building, he said. The empty lot at the south end, she said. The one past the bridge. Now that the bridge is there, it's accessible. He was quiet, but it was his thinking quiet, not his reluctant quiet. She knew the difference. "Funding," he said. "The community fund is in a better position than it's ever been," she said. "And I have contacts in Denver who have been involved in territorial education initiatives. There are grants available for frontier schools." "You've already looked into it," he said. "I've looked into it," she confirmed. He tightened his arm around her slightly. "Alma Walker," he said, using the old name in the particular way he sometimes did when he wanted to acknowledge who she had been before she was his, which she found every time inexplicably moving. "Watkins," she said. "Watkins," he agreed. "What would this town do without you?" "The same thing it would do without you," she said. "Get by considerably less well." He laughed, and she felt it through her shoulder where she leaned against him. And the night air was cool and the stars were unreasonably bright, and the creek ran over stones in the dark as it had always done and would always do, and the town below them was exactly what two people with steady hands and open hearts could build together out of the particular raw material of a frontier life. She closed her eyes and listened to him breathe, and to the town's night sounds, and to the distant sound of the creek. "The South End lot," he said after a while. "Yes," she said. "In the spring," he said. "We'll bring it to the council in the spring." "In the spring," she agreed. The cottonwoods along the creek would be green again by then, and the flower boxes would fill, and the main street of Harlow Creek would smell of new growth and the particular promise of another Wyoming spring, and two people who had found each other in the middle of a set of ledger books would stand on a porch above a mercantile and watch their town continue to become the thing they were building together. day by careful day, entry by honest entry, in the long, bright, full-hearted permanence of a life well kept. She turned her head and kissed his cheek, and he turned to meet her, and the kiss was warm and unhurried in the April dark, the same as it had always been and exactly as she intended it always to be. "Come inside," she said. "In a minute," he said. "I want to look at it a little longer." She looked at him, looking at the town, the thing his father had started and he had continued, and they were carrying forward together. And she felt the love she carried for him settle into its familiar, solid, permanent place, the way a good entry settles in a well-kept book. She stayed on the porch beside him, and they looked at Harlow Creek together until the last lamp in the last window went out, and then they went inside, and the door closed behind them, and the night was quiet and good.